stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today is kind of a special day for our podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. I'm actually recording with my friend Bill Fox, who is living in Tallinn, Estonia. Is that right? Did I pronounce it correctly?
That's correct, Sarah.
Tallinn, Estonia. And we actually met through a friend of mine who lives here in Montana, which I find really fascinating when those connections happen and they're just kind of magical, which is when our listeners hear later on, that's kind of the theme of our episode. So Bill, if you could just share something with us about yourself that most people might not know. I like to ask that question at the very beginning of a podcast so that our listeners get a chance to feel differently connected to you than they might if they just jumped right into a personal story.
Yeah, that's a really good question. A couple of things come to mind, but maybe most immediately is from talking through you previously and with your friend who connected us, I discovered that living in Montana is a lot like living in Estonia. And
really?
Yes. So I thought that was very interesting in many respects in terms of things that are available and how they're available. You know, they're one day, not the next day. You know, things aren't always as fresh as you might like and things of that nature.
Oh, so finding fresh food, fresh produce is a little touch and go over there?
In the wintertime, yes, definitely.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense because distribution would be just as difficult in Estonia as it would be here. But how big is your city where you're living, the capital?
I believe the city is about 800,000 people, but the total population of the country is like 1.6 million.
Oh, so, well, that's really interesting because the entire population of the state of Montana just hit 1 million a couple years ago.
Okay. It's a similar population.
And I bet it's a similar size too, geographically.
Yeah, maybe so. We'd have to check that out.
Yeah. I'll have to link to some pages about your country and where you're living. Thank you. You said there were two things that kind of stood out to you that might be interesting.
You know, I've been asked that question before, and what used to come to mind was I would sometimes tell people I've sailed around the world, but I never saw it. And that's because my career started out in the Navy nuclear submarine service, and I spent a lot of time under the ocean, no sunshine, no fresh air, and we didn't see much of what was going on outside.
Wow. Wow. So you've taken a trip around the world, but didn't actually see it.
Almost, most of the world, didn't completely circumnavigate it.
Wow. That is unusual. I don't think a lot of people could say that. And that's definitely something I didn't know about you. So interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
So let's jump right into the theme of our podcast today, which is how these connections that we make work or don't work and why. Based on the stories that we tell. I had an episode just a little while ago on those small world stories, those odd connections that you make and you realize that you are connected somehow with somebody that should be a total stranger and the likelihood of that kind of thing happening. So this kind of goes along with that theme, but the next part is, do you take those opportunities when they land in your lap? So I'd love to hear that story about how you met your partner, Mari.
There are many places to start that story. And maybe the first place to start is, I guess it was maybe 6 years ago. I was working with a company and a new person had started there. And we were introduced by the president of the company and said we two should chat, that he thought maybe we might be able to help each other in the work that we were each doing. But when I met this woman who was from over this part of the world, when we first met, we just had this instant connection that was very powerful and nothing like I had ever experienced before. And that just set off a whole avalanche of synchronistic events over the next week that told me how I was connected to this person. It was, becoming kind of crazy, actually.
Like what? Can you give me a specific example of? I mean, that's fast, 1 week.
Yeah. The very first thing that happened after we met for lunch, I came back, got on my computer, and as I was checking on my computer, someone new connected with me on Twitter. And I looked at the profile and I said, nah, I think, I'm not sure I want to be connected to this person, but something drew me to look further. And I clicked on it and I went to her website, and she was a poet, musician, and and an artist, and, did all these interesting things. And then I saw she had a book on Amazon, and I thought, well, I'll check that out. And I clicked on the link and I went to Amazon and I clicked on her book to look inside. And in this book, up jumped a poem of how we were connected in the past that spoke directly to what I had just experienced meeting this other woman. And that just, blew me away.
Wow.
And a series of events like that happened all week. And by the end of the week, I wasn't able to sleep because I was so shaken by what was going on. And so I started doing a meditation to help me relax with what was going on. And during that meditation, I experienced my first vision, which really stunned me. And so I shared that with a coach I was working with at the time. And when I shared that story with the coach, she sent me a quote from a woman that spoke to what I had experienced. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. I'm going to see if that person has written a book. And I searched for her name on Amazon. She had not written a book, but up jumped the book that she was quoted in. And on the front cover of that book was the picture that I saw in my vision. And I said, wow, I need to know about this, this person. And, I looked up her website and I got on her mailing list, but nothing really spoke to me. She was a Kabbalah, did work with Kabbalah and did Kabbalah courses and teaching and things like that, which
is a Jewish mysticism.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think a year passed or so before I got an email about a new course she was going to be doing. And I said, wow, that sounds very interesting to me. I'm going to sign up and be part of that. And so I did. And on the other side of the world, my partner, Mari, was having a similar experience and found that she needed to be in this class as well. And when we met through that class, we just had this instant connection. And that started a journey of working together and becoming friends. And after 2 years, we decided to meet for the first time. And, that turned out to be me living here now.
So I love the part of the story that you told me the first time we chatted about, you said, are you sure you want me to come? And she said
yes. And then she said, oh, by the way, we're going to park your car. And I said, well, at the airport, of course. And she said, what if you don't come back? And that hit me like a bolt of lightning. And because I was planning to park at the airport and I had to think fast, and I had enough time to park the car in a long-term storage area. And that's what I did the first time.
And how long were you gone that first trip?
6 weeks or so.
Did you have to change your ticket? Because you had a round trip ticket, right?
Yeah, that was easy to do, fortunately.
So there are many layers to this story that I appreciate. One is just the openness to it. The fact that when you have that sense that you need to do something, that it's almost an obsession when you start to dig into the connectivity of you and the next thing, whatever that is, or the next person, whomever that is, that you allow yourself that curiosity to click through. I don't think everybody does that.
Probably not. I think I've been more inclined to do that all my life. When I think starting from the third grade is the first event I remember, maybe something like that happening, where I was open to what was being presented. And that was, I was in third grade, and there were too many children in the class, and they wanted some children to volunteer to go to another city and attend school there. And I was very quiet and shy. You think I would be the last person who would want to do that. But when they asked me, I said yes. And, that's been a repeating pattern throughout my life. When, the adventure presented itself, I don't shy back. Or either that or...
Tell me more about that. So you're in third grade.
Yeah.
Where was this? What city was this?
It was a city in Western Pennsylvania. And as I think back of it, it's remarkable to me that the teachers were asking a third grade student if they would want to go to school.
8 years old.
Yeah.
They didn't ask your parent.
No.
Wow.
That wouldn't fly in today's age, I don't think. But,
no, not at all. So you said, I'll go. And then from that point on, you were bused to a different town.
Yes.
How far?
It probably added a half hour each way, with all the bus stops in between and the traffic and where we went. But, I grew tremendously out of the experience. It was totally frightening. I was, it was above and beyond me. And, but,
Well, apparently not, but you thought it was.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So tell me about that first day. You obviously have a vision about that first day. You get on the bus and you're terrified, and you show up in your new classroom. Had you been in the same school for the first kindergarten, first grade, second grade?
No, not at all. It was completely... I'm not sure I got your question right, but this new school, I had never been in this school at all.
No, I mean, before that, had you been a student at that other school, your first school?
Yes, kindergarten.
So you, with the same classmates most of the time, and then you voluntarily said, oh, I'll go and start completely over with new friends. And okay, so that's like crazy courageous when you think about it. I mean, there are some of us that would have been like, yeah, I'll go, because we moved around a lot as kids. Like, I went to 4 different elementary schools, so that wouldn't have bothered me at all. But for somebody who had gone to the same school, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, beginning of third. So tell me about what you remember, the vision, the images that pop into your head when you remember that first experience of going into your new school.
The most vivid experience I have is coming in and sitting down in the classroom, and they started doing an exercise where everybody understood what they were doing, and I had no idea what they were doing. And I had to raise my hand and say, I don't understand. What are you doing? And get an explanation of it. But that stands out. Not too much else.
I bet.
Yeah.
And what happened? Why do you think that stands out?
Because I felt so isolated and so, overwhelmed that everybody else was doing something, and I had no clue, what I was to be doing or what they were doing. Mm-hmm. And I felt compelled to, raise my hand and ask for help.
Wow. That again is pretty unusual for somebody who's shy to say, okay, I don't get this. Somebody help me. Usually they just kind of would go off and pretend like they knew what they were doing. How big was the class? Do you remember?
I'm guessing maybe 25, 30 students.
Wow.
Something in that range.
So yeah, that's really early on in your life to be somebody who steps into the unknown, not with confidence, but with curiosity. So, wow. I'm just kind of processing this because I'm trying to think of what I was like or what our boys were like, because I have 2 boys that are 17 and 20 now, and I can imagine my older son doing that, but not my younger son, in a similar way, that he would go in with curiosity, but not necessarily with confidence that he was going to be okay. It was more, I think when he was little, it was more curiosity than anything, like a constant, consistent in his life. Huh. That's just, I'm fascinated. So tell me where that played out again later in life. And I'm curious if you still think about that time in third grade when you're about to step into something unknown again. I mean, is this something, your pattern is obviously there, but do you actually think about it and refer back to that memory?
I think I do. And the next big one I remember is I went to a technical vocational high school where I learned, specialized in electronics, and it was fantastic. I was really into electronics at the time. I had an amateur radio license, and the backyard of my parents' house, I think at one point had 13 different antennas, erected here or there. It was, I can't believe they let me do that. I would not let my kids do that, I don't think. But so I got a really good schooling in electronics. And when I got out, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go to college. I didn't feel ready for it. And I saw an ad to be an electronics technician to work for the company RCA at the time, which was at the time, a pretty well-known brand and
Big
company.
deal, right?
And they were located 90 miles away, but I applied for the job and I got it. And I stepped right into it. But within several months, I said, this isn't how I'm going to spend the rest of my life. This isn't it for me, because I couldn't see it going anywhere. And so I just quit. And I remember coming back, and everybody, my relatives and parents and everybody knew how I'd went to this prestigious company. Why would I quit? I must be crazy, for doing that. And some of my friends were working in the brickyard. And I said, well, okay, I'll go work in the brickyard. And, that was very hard work, and very hot and labor intensive. But, it was money and I was doing something. And while I figured what was next. And one afternoon, we were stacking these bricks as they come out of these presses and onto the cars that go into the ovens. And next working to me happened to be the father of a friend of mine who I went to high school with. And something came over me one afternoon, and I said, oh my gosh, if I don't do something different right now, this is what I'm going to be doing 30, 40 years from now. I'm not going to do that. And it just overcame me. And I said, stop the press. He said, what's wrong? I said, I quit. He said, right now? I said, yes, right now. And I walked back to the lunchroom to get my lunch bucket, and the boss came out and he said, what are you doing? I said, I quit. He said, right now? I said, yes, right now. And I walked out. And, that was it. And I felt guilty about that because, that is the way I would have liked to have done it. But something just told me I needed to get out of there and go do something else now. And the next thing that came along was I heard about this Navy experience getting into the nuclear submarine service. And, it would leverage my electronics experience, and I'd learn about nuclear technology and go on another adventure. And it was a challenge and it was an adventure. But after 6 years, I left.
That's an interesting story. The fact that you just left the job. I mean, that had to have been kind of hard on your colleagues that were there, your peers that were trying to keep working on that line of bricks, and you just walked away.
It was very much. And I'll tell you a funny story. I mean, I always felt guilty about that and wished I hadn't done it that way, because I know it made their day a lot harder.
Uh-huh.
When I went to college after I got out of the Navy, I found myself in a class with a daughter of the boss of the owner of that brickyard. And I was so afraid to tell her that I had worked for her father, because I was afraid she must have heard about this guy who just walked out and quit.
Yeah, I would be worried about that too. Did she ever tell him, or did he ever find out? Did you meet him?
I don't think she ever, I may have told her, I'm not sure. But it was never an issue, but my own guilt was always working against me there.
Isn't that funny how
Yeah.
we'll remember something so deeply and other people really don't have any memory of it at all, but we're so ashamed or uncomfortable with that memory that we hold on to it much longer than anybody else that was impacted by it.
Yes, for sure.
That's funny. So tell me the next one. So I would like to get back into that week of change from the time you connected with that woman from work. Are you still friends with her? What's your relationship with her now?
Yeah, we're still connected. And it was very interesting because, I mean, events like that kept happening all week. I would search for something I was looking for on the internet, and something related to this connection would show up. And it was turning my world upside down. Like, what is reality? What is going on here? And at that point, she got very involved with a paper I was writing for the Cutter Business Technology Journal. And I think the other thing that came out of this from my experience was, okay, I've seen something different here. Life and reality are different than I thought it was. You know, there's something bigger going on here. And I became more fearless in terms of speaking my truth and, you know, saying that in person and also in writing. And so at the time, I had been doing this other interview series called 5 Minutes to Process Improvement Success. And I had started asking experts, you know, what's their best improvement strategy? And almost everyone was telling me something deeper than what they were known for or what they did. They were telling me what was underneath, so to speak, and why what they did was successful or what we should be thinking about. And that really set me off on what I call an inner leader journey. It started changing me from the inside out because I was experiencing this and learning this and seeing another side to things. And so by that time, after I had met this woman and I was writing this paper, I said, okay, what I want to write about here is everything you're doing out there, you're focused on the wrong things. Here's why you're focused on the wrong things. Here's what I'm learning in these interviews. And here's what I think, the direction I think you ought to be looking in. And I thought, they'll never publish it. They'll never publish it. And it ended up being the lead story in that next journal. So, you know, that really, you know, gave me confidence and, you know, that what was happening, what I was learning, how I was changing, there was something to it.
And you were working for the company at the time?
Yes.
And then what happened after that? You published the paper, and you said it was a couple of years before things really started to change.
Yeah, I guess the sequence was, I guess I have to take you back to 2009. And I was managing a transformation project at a corporation, and it had gone really well. And we'd just gotten it to a major milestone, a point of success, a point of celebration. And a new executive came into the company and decided that's not the way they're going to do things and threw it all away. And, you know, it's not uncommon. And it was the third time it had happened in my career where I had experienced this. And I just said, that's it. I'm not doing this anymore like this. I'm going to have an impact on how organizations transform. And that was another time where I quit. I had no job in sight. I just said, I'm out of here. I gave them 2 weeks notice this time, though.
Good.
I learned from my earlier experience.
You don't want to face that regret again, especially if you meet a girl. Oh, my goodness.
And I said, well, what's the first thing I can do? I said, well, I'm going to look for the next conference I can present at so I can tell the story of what we did, because it was getting some recognition and we had done some things right and why it had worked well. And the next conference I found that I could submit an abstract to was occurring in Porto, Portugal. And I said, well, that sounds like a nice place to go. So I submitted the abstract. It got approved. And I submitted it with another person who was involved with the project. And a few months later, we were in Porto talking about that project. Then I said, what's next? And I made a list of different things that I could do. I thought about writing a white paper, and I came up with all these titles. And I sort of forced myself to write. I wanted to come up with a list of 100, but I think I came up with a list of 70. And the list got narrowed down to maybe 10 items, and I started showing it to my colleagues and friends. And one item on the list kept jumping out at people. And I had this idea of this interview series called 5 Minutes to Process Improvement Success, where I would interview people and ask them what their best strategies were. And I didn't really want to do that because I had no experience interviewing people, or doing anything like that. And so, but I decided to pay attention to how people were reacting to that idea, because I could see their energy change. I could see their eyes sparkle. I could see something. And I said that there's something there. So I went ahead with it. And with the very first interview I did, I was just blown away. I said, I can't believe I interviewed someone I knew. I was kind of had expectations of what they would probably be saying, and it was something completely different. And I said, wow, that's powerful and very interesting. And so I went ahead and ended up publishing that interview and doing some more. And the same thing kept happening and happening and happening. And so that had been going on for maybe a year and a half, 2 years before I met this woman where I was working.
Wow. It's so fascinating when we take that leap, when we go from, what am I going to do, to understanding more about ourselves through the eyes of others and what we can do. It sounds to me like a lot of those people you talked to knew you and your ability to draw out those stories more than you knew yourself in that way.
I think that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Are there any people in that group that you think continue to do that for you, that you kind of lean on to help you see yourself from a different perspective?
Not necessarily the people I interviewed, but there are others who have I've been connected with since early in my career that do that. But there were a number of people from that first interview series I interviewed for the next interview series because I knew they were oriented in the direction that things were moving. When I did that first interview series, after I had done 50 interviews for 5 minutes to process improvement success, and it was never about process, I said, that's enough. It's time to close this off and take what I've learned and be open to what's next. And it took about a year and a half before this idea came up for the next interview series, which I currently do. And it seems like it could go on forever.
And what is that one called again?
It's called Exploring Forward-Thinking Workplaces. Right. I came up with a series of questions that tried to leverage what I had learned in the earlier interview series, and at the same time, try and uncover from people the wisdom we needed to move forward in a better way, but at the same time, discover ways we can bridge the gap between the old and the new. One thing I had discovered in my work is that there are many people in the workplace who want to do things in a completely new way. And we talk about they feel like aliens in the workplace, which is how I felt oftentimes. And so we want to connect them with maybe the old command and control leadership, or that seems to be so prevalent in so many companies, and try and bridge that gap with some of the questions we ask.
That makes sense. And exposing all these leaders to this forward thinking, I think can only do good. I mean, even the ones that are cynical about it and are kind of stuck in where they've always been, or how they were trained and how their generation before them were trained in that command and control kind of aspect of leadership. I think exposing them to a group of really successful forward-thinking people and hearing them talk about how it's been successful and why it's been successful, that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I think one thing I've discovered is you kind of have to be ready for this message and to hear it and to see and do things differently. And I think that change begins from the inside out. And I think what the first interview series and that intention I held to have an impact on how organizations transform seemed to set things in motion that I don't fully understand or comprehend. It started bringing me the people, the ideas, the experiences to move that forward. And what I found happening with the interviews when people were telling me what was happening underneath, it was changing me on the inside, and it caused me to explore that inner part of me further. And I became a different person. My state of being was changing. I was becoming less reactive. I was becoming more understanding of separating myself from my mind and what else is going on, and being more open to that I don't have the best ideas or know the best way, being more open to listening to somebody else to understand their point of view, and learning from that, and kind of coming together from that basis. One person who had a very big influence on me was Joseph Jaworski in the book Synchronicity. I had never heard of it, but all of a sudden that book, and he showed up on my radar screen. And when I read the book, I said, oh my gosh, this is what's happening to me. Now I understand, why my life changed and what's happening here to some degree. And I said, I just need to talk to him. And so I reached out and was able to connect and have a conversation with him, and then go to a workshop of his and learn more about these aspects of the inner dimension and bigger conversations.
So I have some theories about how these kinds of things work. And I haven't read that book yet, Synchronicity, and I probably need to do that, because I'm guessing it'll confirm some of how I've been thinking over the last 10 years, which is simply that our subconscious and unconscious minds are so much more than we give them credit for. They see our inside, our subconscious and unconscious minds are like incredibly powerful computers, and we observe so much around us, we feel so much around us that our conscious mind could never fully process. There's just no way for it to fully process. And so when we're open to the stimulants that come near us, we allow our subconscious and unconscious minds to send us signals, which is why it's not anything magical. Although I love a good dose of mysticism through Kabbalah and that kind of thing. But I really don't think it's anything magical. I think we have the capacity. We just, we have to be open to it. And so when we see things like that, we say, oh, deja vu, I truly believe that our subconscious or unconscious mind has already observed something that is likely to happen. And so when it does happen, it feels like we already knew that was going to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, Sarah. And I know one thing I've really tuned into helping me in this dimension is something called the Sedona method. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
No, I haven't.
But one thing they talk about is our belief systems, how our belief systems are really act as filters, and they really channel, what comes in and what we pay attention to. And as long as we have those belief systems, we don't see what else is there. And so that method really helps you neutralize those belief systems, so you are more open, do become more aware, and
that makes
wider
sense.
perspective. Yeah,
I would love to have some more strategies to do that, because I feel like I'm pretty open, but every once in a while I wonder what's going on around me. And that actually brings me right back to the original concept where you had 70 titles for this paper that you were going to write, or the interviews you were going to do, whatever you were going to do next. And you got it down to 10, and then you showed it around to people, and you said that the majority of them sparked when you showed them one particular title. And the thing that keeps coming back to me is that so many times the people around us who know us can pinpoint what we're supposed to be doing next better than we can. And I think it has something to do, again, with that whole synchronicity, that ability of our subconscious and unconscious minds to pick things up, but not just about ourselves, but about others, people around us. So they might not have known why that was sparking their interest for you in particular, but they just knew that this was a good fit for you. Have you seen that in other situations in your life?
I had to think about that a moment. I think that's a really good insight, and I think that's probably true. But yeah, I guess what immediately comes to mind is when I was growing up, I had an uncle that took a real interest in me. And, you know, he was always just expressing, wow, you can do that, and really encouraging me. He saw sides of me that no one else could express or see. And I think if, I never would have become the person I am without his nurturing during those years.
Fascinating. I think about that a lot. The people that I surround myself with and what they see in me that I can't necessarily see in myself. And I think particularly of my husband. We've been together since 1995. So that's a long time to be together. And from early on, he would tell me things that I was good at, and in terms of relationship building and negotiation, being able to connect people appropriately, just know when somebody needs to meet somebody else, and being able to negotiate that relationship somehow. And never as a yenta. I mean, it was never like a matchmaking thing. I was always terrible at that. But I've always been good at recognizing the strengths of somebody and knowing someone else who would complement those strengths, and something that could be magical if these people got together, these companies got together. And it took me 20 years to really hear him, but also to be able to understand how that applied to helping people and to actually having an income. Because I understood that I was good at certain things, but I never understood how to apply that to something that people would pay for, that would provide value, and not lose myself in the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so, Sarah. I'm thinking in my experience here with you in our earlier conversation and in this conversation, and how you are really good at keying in on certain aspects and events and stories, and pulling those out and seeing the significance and relevance of them. So yeah, that's very good.
Well, thank goodness, because I bet everything on this skill when I left my last job. Decided to go solo and try this out and see if I can make it work. So thank you. I appreciate that
You're
encouragement. This has been a fascinating conversation, Bill. I am so grateful that you've taken the time to talk through these stories with me, because I think not enough people really take a step back with enough time in front of them to be able to apply what they learn when they take that step back and see those patterns, and particularly be open to allowing others to help generate ideas for us, others that might see us in a way that we couldn't possibly see ourselves, especially if we're particularly self-critical. And so I'm fascinated by so much of what we talked about today. I think I'm going to be processing this conversation for a long time.
Oh, good. There's probably one other aspect of the story you may be interested in hearing, and that is how the events of 9/11 triggered a lot of this. And I was doing work in Washington, D.C. at the time, and as I was traveling into the city, I was hearing things unfold on the radio. And when I heard the second building had been hit, I said, I'll bet Washington, D.C. is going to be hit too, I think, when going back home. Because who knew what was going to happen?
Right.
And, as I was driving back to Northern Virginia, all of a sudden I saw, numerous fire trucks rushing into the city. And so I knew something had probably happened. It wasn't on the radio yet, but I was kind of rushing back to get back home with my heart in my throat, thinking, wow, the world has really changed. But the thing that came to the forefront was I'm living my life differently now. Right now, I'm going to do what I really want to do. I'm going to live my life. It's going to be different. And the first thing that came to mind is I always wanted to be a pilot. I'm going to take pilot lessons. And within a few days, I went out to the airport, even though it was closed, nobody was flying for weeks or months. I said, I want to learn how to fly. And I enrolled in ground training and, just went on with that experience. But when I got up in the air, I just fell in love with the higher perspective you could see from the pilot's cockpit. That this became my special place. And I just started photographing it and sharing it with people. And, and they were taking in the experience I was seeing up there. And it just led me to all sorts of, very interesting adventures and places to see and go fly and take pictures, including even flying around the Hawaii Islands and over volcanoes and things like that. But I didn't share them at work. But that incident that happened in 2009, some of the people in my project heard I was flying on the weekends and taking pictures. And on Monday morning for the status meetings, they would say, "Hey, where did you go this weekend? Show us some pictures." Well, okay, I'll show you a few pictures. But I noticed people were having the experience I was having. They were breathing differently, sitting back and looking at the world differently. And so, that whole experience touched me in all dimensions of my life. I started taking a higher perspective to everything. And, and then for a while, I wrote about that a lot and combined those pictures with my writing to talk about making those type of changes. That was pivotal. And, what was next?
I think that was a pivotal experience for millions of us.
Yes.
And it's amazing how something so seemingly far removed impacts us across the board. I mean, I wasn't far removed from it because we had just moved away from Washington, D.C. A year and a half before that. So we moved in 99, in April of 99. And I actually had tickets. We were flying out to the district, to National Airport. We had our tickets to leave 3 weeks after the 9/11 events. And I remember when it happened, thinking that just like when the Challenger exploded, I was in middle school, that this was going to impact our world in a pretty major way. And I was encouraged by so much camaraderie and the fact that everyone had some connection to it. Whoever you talk to, they either knew someone who used to live there and worked in the Twin Towers, or they knew someone, they were the cousin of somebody who died there, or everyone had something within 3 degrees of separation of one of those explosions, one of the 4 planes. And I remember thinking that was going to be the case, that everyone would find some degree of connection to what happened, not only because they needed to. I think in some cases you feel compelled to be connected somehow, but also because they wanted to have something to remember what happened in that pivotal time for themselves. And having a specific connection to point to helps us dig into that memory and make it stay relevant in our minds. It was a fascinating time, for sure.
Yeah, it totally was.
I remember it so vividly because we were here in Montana, totally removed. And yet, of course, we had friends all over the East Coast, family all over the East Coast. My uncle actually worked for the Pentagon at the time, but he wasn't on site. And my husband was watching the footage, the CNN footage of the people jumping out of windows in the second tower and the fire. And he kept watching. He was totally sucked into it. He couldn't tear his eyes away from it. And we had a nearly 3-year-old at the time. He was almost 3. And at some point, I remember saying to my husband, "You can't watch that with Jacob in the room." And he said, "Well, he doesn't understand it. He doesn't know what it is." And I said, "That's why you can't watch it with him. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have any context for it. So you need to just either turn it off or not let him in the room when you're watching that footage." And he kind of rolled his eyes and humored me with it. And okay, I won't let Jacob see it. And the week before we were supposed to fly out, the flights were starting to resume, and I knew we were going to be able to go. And we're sitting at the dining room table eating dinner, and I hear Jacob kind of talking about airplanes. And I said, well, we get to go see your cousins in 1 week. In 1 week, we get to go on an airplane and go and see your cousins, and it's going to be so much fun. And he looked at both of us across the table. He looked at me to the right. He looked at his dad to the left. And he got a very concerned expression on his face. He said, but we're not going on the fire airplane.
Yeah, wow.
And I remember looking at my husband with that mom look and the lifted left eyebrow.
Yeah,
and I said,
I'm familiar with that
honey,
look.
yes, we're not going on the fire airplane. And so even subconsciously, he probably has some memory of that pivotal time.
Yeah, I think very much so.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, we've gone all over the place.
Yes, we have.
All over the world, as a matter of fact. So just before we hang up, tell me what it's like in Estonia right now. What's the weather like?
It's about 25, 26 degrees right now. And
Fahrenheit?
Yeah, it's pretty typical right now. It's been colder. It snows just about every day. It keeps mounting up day after day. Sometimes it gets up a little above freezing, and so you get the ice accumulating. And one interesting thing about Estonia is they do a pretty good job of clearing the main roads, but the side streets, the sidewalks, the parking lots do not get cleared. And it is not easy getting around on foot here at times. And
No
I had to get a completely different pair of shoes that would grip on ice because there's a lot of ice in the wintertime, and you really need to be careful.
Wow. Well, that makes sense because you're right on the Baltic Sea, right?
Yeah. It helps keep it warmer than it might otherwise be.
But with the moisture from the ocean moisture or the sea moisture coming in, it must get really chilly, like to the bone.
Yeah. And I think the most difficult part I found living here are the short days this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
In December, they're about 6 hours of daylight. And also this time of year, the days are mostly gray and overcast. It starts changing now and we get a little bit more sun, but such short days and gray days. We're popping some vitamin D and other vitamins.
No kidding. I would really struggle with that. That's, well, it sounds like it's pretty similar to Montana in terms of getting snow, and but it is frigid here this week, just like it has been across the U.S. for the past week or so.
Yeah, you really got cold there.
And even though it's -4 degrees out here, I can't imagine it's as cold feeling as it is in Estonia, where it's moist and 22. And once that wind kicks up, it's just ridiculously cold.
Yeah, very much. The first year I was here, I got here about this time of year, and it was near 0 degrees quite frequently. It was a bit colder that year. But I also started to understand why saunas are so popular in this part of the world. They're a lifesaver in this time of year.
My younger son desperately wants us to build a sauna in the backyard. Yeah. We've been considering it.
Yeah, they're nice.
And this winter, we're really considering it. Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast episode. I really appreciate the time. For our listeners, I will have some links in the blog post associated with this podcast. I'll link to a couple of the books that Bill mentioned during our conversation, and also to connect with Bill. I'll have some links for that. And so you can learn a little bit more about him and maybe connect with him and learn more about his interviews that are really just fascinating to listen to, and so full of hope and encouragement to me that leaders of corporations and companies are finally starting to really understand how important it is to engage their employees and treat them as a whole human and not just a worker bee.
That was beautifully said, Sarah. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I really loved the conversation, and looking forward to hearing it, how it comes out.
Me too. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?